You're all very welcome. My name is Anne Dixon. I'm the Director of the Chief Executives Forum, and on behalf of Heather Moorhead, the Director at the Public Sector Chairs Forum, we're delighted to welcome you to today's briefing. We have around 60 people registered for the call from all parts of the public sector. I want to thank Dr. Petra Kaur for making the time to engage with us today. As you'll have seen from the notes, Dr. Kaur is playing a central role in the COVID-19 response across the public sector. We've convened this session on the back of a series of discussions with chief executives and chairs, which took place in early April, where they identified supporting mental health and well-being in the workforce as a key challenge during this period of the pandemic, right up there alongside maintaining good governance. And I think the response to today's session has effectively proved that point. So before I hand over to Petra, I want to quickly run through a few points on the format for today's session. The session is being recorded and will be placed online, hopefully, subject to the technology not letting us down. We do want this to be an interactive session. You're all currently on mute, and that's simply to reduce the background noise as we get going. Petra's presentation will run for around 40 minutes, and we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers after that, and you can all unmute yourselves as you want to chip into that. Obviously, given the numbers, it mightn't be possible to for everyone to get in with questions, so we'd really like you to use the Zoom chat facility during the session to feed in any questions or comments as the session progresses. So if you could take a moment just to locate the chat button on your screen, it should be at the bottom of your screen. And we'd be also grateful if you're feeding into that you can ensure your name is displayed, and you can amend the name that's displayed by clicking on the three dots on your picture. These comments will be monitored throughout the session, and we will endeavour to feed them all through for response as the session continues. If you want to ask a question, you can use the virtual wave, which you should find in the participants section on Zoom, or indeed you can try an actual wave, and we will be trying to pick everyone up through that. If you have any issues with bandwidth or reception during the session, it might be helpful to disable your video format but keep on the audio. We'll know you're still there and we'll be able to pick anything up from you. I would say if you're having any particular difficulties on Zoom, if you send a personal message through the chat function to Pamela Carson, my colleague, who is our Zoom expert, and she will endeavour to sort any issues out for you. So with that, I'll hand over to Petra to get us started.
Thanks, Anne, and thank you very much for the invitation to join everybody today, and great to see so many people taking time out of your busy diaries to join us and to think together about how we can support psychological well-being within your organisation. This has been a really difficult time. It's been challenging in so many ways for so many of us, both personally and professionally. Many of us have had and experienced significant losses within our families. We've experienced bereavements, both COVID and non-COVID. We've experienced sickness within families. We've experienced tensions within our families, with our children as we attempt to homeschool, with our work colleagues as we attempt to take on new roles. And we've moved into different roles and very different times as we work, sometimes from home, sometimes in offices, sometimes in very isolated patterns. So these are very different times for us. And as we think of that, we think about, oops, sorry, actually. Okay. Can you see the new slide? Just check, yes, Margaret Bateson can see it, I see her smiling. People of a certain vintage will recognise Dorothy and Toto. For those of you who are too young, apologies, but Dorothy and Toto landed after the storm in Kansas, and as they left Kansas and they looked around, and Dorothy said, "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore." And I think for many of us, it has felt a bit like that. We've been in the same place, we've actually been in the same world, but it's felt very, very different. And there is something for us as we move forward to think about how we manage in this different world, because actually as we move forward, what we know now more than ever is that actually things are unlikely to ever be quite the same for the foreseeable future, and maybe possibly ever. So within health and social care, and the work that I'm here to talk about today is based on work that was carried out within health and social care across Northern Ireland, but I feel has an applicability for all of our services because the issues are the same regardless of the provider, and many of us have similar experiences with the stakeholders that we engage with and that you engage with. So I hope there's a resonance for you around this. In the anticipatory phase of the surge in the pandemic, around the early stages of March, a group of us got together, chaired by Tony Stevens, who many of you will know, who was the ex-chief executive of the Northern Trust, just outgoing at that point, with colleagues from across the region, from across all sectors in healthcare provision, from care sectors and GP sectors, trusts, NIAS and so on, to develop a framework to support workforce wellbeing. It was a values-based approach and based on the best evidence. There's a focus on principles throughout it, and it highlights the phases of the pandemic and the associated staff responses throughout those phases. What we did was we developed a framework for leaders and managers, and I'll give you the links to those later. It's a very short read and should hopefully be of some relevance and use to you, albeit that you're largely from outside health and social care. And we also developed in parallel a series of helpful organisational resources that individuals can again pick up from the PHA website, and I'll share those links with you. The resources focus not just on our own well-being and our team's well-being, but also for those of us who have children, who work with people with disabilities and so on, around various resources that can be used to help us to think about our own well-being and others around us. Because when we started to scope and to think about the issues that staff may face at this point in time, there was a myriad of issues. We began to scope the worries and concerns that our staff were facing at that point in time. We found that they were concerned about their own health, they were concerned about loved ones, they were concerned about social distancing and isolation, about a disconnection from others. They were concerned about a loss of planned events, things that they had hoped for, things that were planned, weddings that were planned, parties that were planned, events that are normal routines and habits, hobbies. Those experiences and the perceived loss and the likely loss of those experiences at that point in time, added on top with very specific COVID issues that happened within our work context around concerns around contact with COVID patients and very real safety concerns, changes in our service structures and strains in our capacity, the fear of dealing with distressed patients and families, the fear of the surge, and as we looked to Italy and to Spain and saw signs of patients on trolleys and staff, doctors, nurses at the end of their tethers, we were very worried about what was going to happen, and it led to our staff experiencing high levels of uncertainty, fear, stress, helplessness, burnout, and indeed moral injury or distress. And I suppose when we then began to think about it for our leaders within our organisations, for those of us in senior positions, for you as chief executives and senior leaders across organisations, we actually identified that the issues were just the same. But on top of that was a layer of responsibility associated with the organisation, with the governance of the organisation, with what would happen in the tail of this as you looked forward and you thought about, well, how will the look back go? And yet at the same time managing your own anxieties, fears, worries. And with that in mind, we began to develop a staff support protective shield. So we were very conscious about the person in the middle of the circle that everything was directed at. And our aim was to think about supports that we could put in place that would mitigate the impact of that myriad of strains and stresses and worries and concerns and changes that were having an impact on our staff. We were keen to develop a protective shield, and therefore within health and social care, one of the first things that we did was to scope our organisations. And I'm sure many of you did this as well at that point in time. And we looked around us to see what we had that we could mobilise. And in the first scope, we were thinking, well, we have occupational health and we have psychology services, and really it was quite limited. And then we began to think, we thought, well, actually we have our trade unions and we have our chaplains, and we have our health and wellbeing groups, we have our health and safety teams. So actually the longer we thought about it and the more we scoped, the broader a range of resources seemed. And actually that in itself was quite cathartic and supportive, to begin to think about the broad range of resources that we have available to us moving forward. And actually there are probably many more resources. If we were to do that exercise again at this point in time, I think there's many other resources that we would actually identify that have made a massive difference to us. I want to move on to talk briefly, because I've really talked about the early stages of planning, and I do want to move through this quite quickly, because I want to move through the stages, because those anticipatory stages are behind us. And in the general rule of thumb in presentations, if we were in a real world, I would be apologising and not having this slide. But actually one of the positives of Zoom that we take away in our reset world as we move is that actually you can have slides with too many words on them. You can do bad practice. So apologies, there still remains too many words on this, but I suppose what I will draw your attention to is the line at the top. So the key phases of prepare, active and recover. And below that, a recognition that in the prepare phase, there was high levels of anticipatory anxiety. And many of you will recall that, certainly within health and social care, we were hectically planning. We were building ICUs, we were moving wards, we were getting ventilators, we were creating pruning teams, we were creating COVID testing teams, and so on. There was much work being done, and during this time, this is the time when we were developing these resources. So from a psychology perspective and a psychological perspective, there was much work going on thinking about how we would mitigate the moral injury and moral distress that was likely to impact our people moving forward. The next phase then is actually the heroics and surge to solution, and the disillusionment and exhaustion. And the final stage is the recovery stage. I suppose within the heroics and surge to solution and disillusion and exhaustion stage, I think we still remain very much within this active phase, with some move towards recovery. And this is not a linear model. Really, there's an opportunity to move between these phases, to move back and forward. The heroics and surge to solution was a phase when again there was a high level of camaraderie as organisations boundaries were tested and people had an opportunity to work together in very creative ways. However, there were some frustrations at times as we did dance and inadvertently stood on each other's toes, and we needed to be mindful of that. And actually I feel that we've moved through much of that phase, and we possibly at times are in the disillusionment and exhaustion phase. And during this phase, what we've seen is people feeling more despairing, more flat, more tired than they previously would have. That actually being on full go mode for so long has been somewhat exhausting, and that actually that's been really challenging. That we've neglected our physical and psychological self-care. I've stopped my yoga. I haven't engaged in online yoga. I haven't been good at taking annual leave, so don't in any way think I'm coming here to advise you from a position of having engaged well with my own strategies. There are times that I haven't done the right things either, and that I have felt exhausted, and I have reminded myself of the need to actually re-engage and to go out for walks and to do those things. So there is something about this disillusionment and exhaustion phase that feels very real to us, and there's a high risk of moral distress and moral injury throughout this phase and into the next stage as people witness things that they have previously not felt that they would ever see or that they would ever be part of in their working careers. And then finally we move through to the recovery stage. And the recovery stage, I suppose I would hopefully say that most people will cope very well. They will use their own individual resources, their own individual style to actually cope and to come to terms. For some people, they may actually experience post-traumatic growth, whereby they have learnt new skills, they have a revised vitality and energy and enthusiasm. They've seen positive sides of individuals and are in a better place coming out the far side. And I suppose as leaders, what we want to do is to create contexts and environments that support post-traumatic growth as opposed to PTSD, anxiety, depression, and subsequent mental health issues. So it's very important for us to think about how we can support our organisations to develop opportunities for post-traumatic growth within our staff teams. Other examples across the phases are shown in the second slide, but I'm not going to go into those because I'm keen for us to move on. So you will have an opportunity to look at this as we move, when you get the slides sent to you. So the phases are key to our understanding of the processes. And as we've moved from the anticipation phase through into the surge phase, we have seen people move between the heroics and the disillusionment, and we're now moving towards recovery. However, we do move back and forward. As there's a new challenge presented to us, we find ourselves potentially engaging again with camaraderie and problem solving in a heroic surge to respond to solution. And when we think about all of this, it's important to understand what's happening within our emotional regulation. And I'm sure many of us have felt very overwhelmed at times. Now, part of that can be to do with the exhaustion and tiredness and the not having taken a break. But actually, there's three competing systems that work together, and in an ideal world, work in a regulated way to support emotional regulation. The challenge, however, is that on occasions, these can become unbalanced, and the lovely even circles that we see here and ovoids that we see here actually become unbalanced. And in fact, I've subconsciously made my green circle a little bit larger than my other two, but that's probably not reflective of where we're at present. And in the main, it's likely that we're sitting with a fairly large red and blue circle at present, and probably a smaller green circle. So our threat system has potentially been activated for a prolonged period, where our concerns around safety that are really important in terms of keeping us safe, so social distancing and the viruses in the community. We know this is important for us to constantly be aware of, but the heightened level of threat in our system can and is at risk of unbalancing our system. In addition, in particular during any surge to create solutions or drive, the blue circle, the blue ovoids that you see there, is in fact overly focused as well, and we can find that that can become unbalanced. So we can have a very large focus on threat and drive, and if we don't balance that by actually making even more time for self-soothing, we become very unbalanced, and it becomes difficult for us to manage our emotional regulation. So what can you do in terms of rebalancing as leaders within organisations? The leadership framework that I've shared the link for, and that you'll be able to pick up at the end of this, is a very brief document. It's only a sort of a 10 to 15 minute read, and it talks about key principles. It recognises the importance of visible leadership, the importance of communicating with your staff, making sure that there's a good communication strategy throughout your organisation, and that connects all the way from the top, all the way through all the layers, and that each group and each team and each service are connecting together, and that they have that opportunity to think together, both in a work-based way, but also at a human level. If you think about all the 5 minutes before meetings, the cups of tea, the coffees, the times when we find out what's happened at the weekend, they're really important. They're really important times for us. They're very often the jam that sticks us together when things can go badly wrong within, and it's drawing on those good relationships that can get us through difficult times. So it remains really important for us to think about human connection and peer support. The document also recognises the importance of physical safety, and as we move towards more engagement in the workplace, actually this is going to be really important. It's going to be important for us to think about how we facilitate social distancing, how we facilitate and support our staff coming to work, using public transport. How does all of that work in this new world that we find ourselves in? And it's really important for us to meet those physical safety needs, because without meeting those physical safety needs, we can't actually then build anything around psychological well-being or psychological safety. It's important for you and for us as leaders to normalise psychological reactions, to acknowledge that you feel despairing at times, to acknowledge that at times that you have enjoyed the opportunity and the camaraderie that has gone with the various phases, but that has been also at the cost on other occasions of feeling very overwhelmed and fatigued, because your staff will be feeling similar, and it's important for them to realise that these are normal reactions and normal emotions. It's important for us to support wellbeing in stepped ways. And within health and social care, it's important for us to ensure that our staff are ensuring that the psychological care to patients and families is front and centre of their thinking. And for your staff, it's important for your groups to be mindful of the needs of the stakeholder organisations and the clients that you have, and that the key tasks that your groups are focused on are front and centre in their minds. And finally, last but not least, there's an important message around taking care of ourselves, because by taking care of ourselves, we're better able to take care of our organisations. I'm not going to, all of you could lecture me on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, although I must say I do particularly like this little colourful version of Maslow. So all I will say at this point is, if you remember, we talked earlier about the importance of trying to develop circumstances whereby we have the greatest number of our staff experiencing post-traumatic growth rather than PTSD and mental health needs. How this happens is by ensuring that we build an organisation and an organisational response that meets all of the layers within this pyramid. So we must meet the psychological safety needs. We must consider the dependability of ourselves as leaders and of our organisation. We must build belonging and meaning. And finally, that will allow us then to deliver on impact. Within our trust, we developed a stepped care model for psychological support. And this is similar to many of the trusts across Northern Ireland. We created opportunities for promoting psychologically minded services through the development of resources and information, and that's all shared in the PHA website that I mentioned earlier. We also developed supports for our staff, and I'm sure many of you have done likewise within your organisations. We developed opportunities to consult with managers and team leaders, to provide drop-in centres, to provide helplines, to offer support to teams and to managers, and to develop skills-based training programs so that staff felt able to have the conversations that they needed to have at difficult times. We also have a top layer of our pyramid whereby we can respond to those in greatest need through referral to our occupational health clinical psychology service, and through opportunities for debriefs with specific teams. So in considering team resilience, there really are, if you think about the little hats of the Maslow hierarchy of need that was interpreted for teams, the key elements of team resilience are around psychological safety and dependability, around belonging, and around meaning and impact. And I'm going to talk briefly about each of those before moving on then to think about self-care and looking after yourself as a leader. So in building psychological safety, some of the things that we can helpfully do is to consider how we frame difficulties as challenges. It's important for us not to be blaming organisations, to acknowledge our own fallibility and our own uncertainties in these unprecedented times, and to respond with curiosity and with interest. And by modelling this response with curiosity and interest, our staff will feel able to be creative, to create solutions, and to feel safe in attempting new ways of dealing with unprecedented demands. We also know that by building belonging, our staff are much more able to make a difference. So it's really important for us to build belonging and to maintain connections within our services. So you'll recall we talked earlier about the importance of connections. The connections and the raison d'etre of your organisations are really important as we build belonging within our teams. And then the final tasks are around creating meaning and impact for our staff. And many of you are doing this on a day and daily basis anyway, but I just think this is quite a nice little story, a nice little demonstration of creating meaning and impact. When we think about three men building a wall, we can see that they're all basically doing the same task. They're all laying bricks on the building site to create the wall. And when we go along and we ask the first person, what are you doing? He says, well, what do you think I'm doing? I'm building a wall, which is kind of self-explanatory. We go to the second person and we ask him exactly the same question. And he says, well, I'm here building a wall because that allows me to feed my family. And I've got this lovely new baby, and this is really important for me because I feel as if I'm providing for my family. So it's really important for me to be here and to build the wall. And finally, we go to the third man who's building the wall, and we say, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm here and I'm creating a cathedral. And the cathedral is going to be a place where people can come and consider how they create peace and space in their world. And it'll give them an opportunity to reflect, and hopefully it'll make this place, make this town a better place. And these three men were all doing exactly the same job, but actually their narrative around the job created meaning and enabled them to feel that they were making a difference and making an impact in their community. And I would suggest that the literature that exists around differences around people who have a greater sense of meaning and purpose around their role suggests that they will be much better engaged within their organisation, that they will feel that their work is more important and adds more value, and will be more likely to experience post-traumatic growth than PTSD and subsequent mental health needs. So therefore, it's really important for us to think about these aspects of belonging, of building meaning and impact within our organisations and for our teams, and so on. But actually none of this can happen if we don't look after ourselves as leaders. Because before we can start to lead others, we must know how to lead ourselves. And actually the challenges in our leading ourselves in these very difficult times are such that it can be really difficult to self-manage. So we do need to take space for ourselves, and particularly in very senior roles like you hold, where you'll find that you are potentially very isolated and very much on your own. And actually the need for you to be strong and to be a leader can feel very heavy and weigh very heavily on your shoulders. So I suppose what I would like you to reflect on now as we move and transition into the second part, and you'll be glad to hear the shorter part of the presentation, so we are still on track, is to think about what you're having to do or not do that's different for you at this point in time. And what within that are you finding most challenging? And I'm keen for you to think about how is it for you to be managing all of this at this point in time and through these last long 10 weeks. And then how are you resourcing yourself to do all of that? Because it's really important to take time to reflect and to think about what's different and about how we've managed. Because as a leader, you're having to deal, and we are having to deal with complex and uncertain situations while managing your own emotions and actions. You're having to inspire and motivate those around you. You're having to lead while managing their emotions and actions. And all the while appearing calm and control and swan-like. But I suppose key to it, I feel, is remaining authentic. And while there's a balance of remaining calm and control, there also is something about being authentic and being able to acknowledge the times when you found it tough and being able to acknowledge and normalize your own psychological responses. And that's a difficult path to walk because we don't want to be unduly confiding and sharing, but actually by acknowledging our own responses, we can remain authentic because people will see you then as having that human connection, that human response to the difficult times that we find ourselves in. And in contrast, if it starts to fall apart, there are risks to our own health and well-being. If our balance goes, if our three circles continue to be very focused in the red threat area and the blue drive area, as we constantly problem solve and as we constantly scan the environment for signs of threat and things that may be a concern to us, and not just physical threat, but all aspects of threat within our environment, we really need to big up our green circle. So it's really important for you to add more stuff in to your self-care regime. because if it falls apart, there's risks for our own health and well-being. There's risks for our relationships with others. The tensions continue. And there's also risks for our own performance and the performance of our organisations. So for us to thrive as leaders, there's four key components: self-awareness, self-connection, self-compassion, and self-care. And I'm going to briefly mention some thoughts and reflections that I have on each of these key areas. So self-awareness is recognizing what's there. And sometimes we don't take time to even do that. So it's really important for us to take time to stop, to step back from situations, to attempt to not be reactive. And a good way to do that is to try and slow it all down, to take a few slow, deep breaths, and to almost move outside of yourself, to begin to observe, what am I thinking? What is this emotion? And begin to name it. What am I feeling in my body? What do I feel like doing or not doing? What's my automatic response, if you like, in this situation? And then to take some perspective, to think, well, what would someone else say about this? Do I have to do it right now? And then to also think, well, what might this person be dealing with that has brought them to me at this point in time with this message, with this unfortunate email, with this ill-considered response? And to think about where they're coming from. And then finally, I think it's thinking, well, how do we practice what works for us? What would be the most helpful thing for me to do right now? And what's likely to happen if I actually do that? It's a very simple little chain, but it's very effective. So just taking a little bit of time, taking a little bit of space to breathe, to think, to observe, to take perspective, and then to practice. Because our self-awareness, the importance of recognizing what's there, what's happening within us, is really important. It's also really important, and you'll know this better than anybody, to only think about the things that we can control and the things that we can influence. Because the blue circle, we are going to struggle to make any difference in. So we need to restrict or attempts to influence to the areas that we can, and that will limit the demands that we put upon ourselves. We also need to recognise what matters to us, so self-connection. And this has potentially been, I feel, one of the real benefits of COVID, is that we've had a chance to think about what's important to us, to recalibrate, to think, do we need all these things that we've worked so hard for? What's important in our work? What's important in our services? What's important in the systems that we deliver? What's important in our personal lives? There's an opportunity for us to connect with our values, our personal values and our organisational values, to connect with what matters and to think about what the priorities are for us. Because we only have one life and we have a number of choices. And it's really important for us to live our best life, as the cliche goes, but to live it in line with the values and the priorities that we have around us. And then we need to think about our compassion towards ourselves. And I think we can be very critical of ourselves on occasions, and we can focus on our drive circle. So if you go back to the circles again, our blue circle, our drive circle can very often in senior leadership positions be highly activated a lot of the time. And we need to think about how we talk to ourselves, as Lisa Hayes would say, because we're actually listening. And the messages that we talk to ourselves are the messages that we hear about ourselves, and can be the ways that we begin to live our lives. And I think there's a helpful little story, which is about thinking about the parallel of your sat-nav system in your car. not about how you talk to your sat-nav system, but about how your sat-nav system talks to you. And what we want to do is to create a similar relationship with ourselves that our sat-nav system has with us. Our sat-nav system is very forgiving. It forgives us when we make a mistake. It gives us clear instructions about how to remedy the wrong directions that we've gone in. It doesn't punish us. It doesn't throw it back in our face when we make another wrong turn at a later stage. It doesn't say, there you go again. It merely calmly recalculates and gives us calm advice to redirect us back onto the road. Because the reality is, this is a bit like how we live our lives in a values-based way, that we can at times be on the wrong path. But actually, by just noticing that we're on the wrong path and allowing ourselves to turn around and to try to get back to the right path will actually enable us to gently redirect and to be more self-compassionate. So self-compassion is really important to us as we attempt to live a values-based approach with new priorities and look after ourselves as leaders. And like any skill, the more we practice it, the more familiar we become with it, the better we are. So it's important not to be critical of our self-compassion, because we might not do that right initially, but that's okay. It's just about noticing that and reminding ourselves of the importance of doing it. And then moving on to our fourth component to enable us to thrive as leaders, to think about self-care. And you know what works for you, I know what works for me. We know the good things and we know the less good things. We know the things that actually are really helpful for us to do in the longer run. So it might be taking time to read a book, sit in the sun, enjoy the sound of the birds. And the birds are just wonderful. There are definitely more birds. So taking time to actually enjoy nature around us, taking time to do our fitness regimes, to go out for walks, to go for a run, to go for a cycle, to maybe lie in the grass and just feel the warmth of the sun on our faces. To look after other people, whether that be psychologically or actually providing some support to others, to have people's back, to feel that you're looking after others and that that's part of how you look after yourself, because we all feel good when we do the right thing. So there's something about working out what your own self-care prescription is for you and actually implementing that and doing the best that we can to enable us to look after ourselves. So our key tasks as leaders in helping ourselves to thrive is to consider our self-awareness. So recognizing what's there, what's happening, to connect with what matters through self-connection, to become our own sat-nav system rather than our critical voice, and to gently redirect us back on to the values path that we want to be on, and to do the things that we can to care for ourselves as individuals at this time. But also to remember, and particularly for you as very senior individuals within organisations, that you're not actually alone, that there are others. To be aware of the support that's available to you and to use it. To talk with colleagues. Your colleagues across this group are all senior individuals who have similar challenges. By forming little groups, little networks of people who are like-minded, it can be really helpful to alleviate stress. Try and avoid complaining, because that just makes it worse. To think about how you can access those informal supports is really important. But also, there is value in formal support at times. There comes a point in time when it can be really helpful to think about what else do you need. And that formal support will be there for you. And there are many organisations that provide formal support for all of us that we can go to find space to allow us to think and to reflect. And also thinking about the informal supports outside of work, our family, our friends, and other groups that we connect with. Because at this point in time, in the midst of all the chaos of regathering ourselves after COVID and preparing ourselves for another surge, potentially, of COVID, and attempting to transform ourselves and to reflect on our values and our principles and our priorities in the meantime. I suppose my favourite thing to think about is that at this point in time, what we need to do is to do the best that we can until we know better. And then at that point, when we know better, we can do better. And I think that's all we should ask of ourselves. And we should attempt to be that sat-nav in our own lives. I said I would share with you the resources, and those are the links to the PHA website for the Framework for Leaders, which, as I say, is only a very quick read, and has some helpful hints and resources, albeit that it was written for a health and social care workforce, but may well have applicability in your organisation. And also the range of resources that, again, can be drawn down off the PHA website, and it's open to all. It's a resource for all. So that is the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and thank you all for listening.
Petra, I think on behalf of all of us, a huge thank you. That was a really powerful and thought-provoking presentation. And it's clear from the really extensive comments we've had on the chat function throughout that presentation that it has resonated really strongly with all our participants today. And can I just say thank you to everyone participating for that great interaction on the chat function. I want to mention specifically Jennifer Welsh, and thank you for joining us today, Jennifer. You made some really useful contributions along the way to keep us on track. Obviously, huge consensus across everyone today in terms of what we're all going through. The pace of change and transformation to the way all of us do our work, live our lives, and deliver public services is really significant, and it's the kind of change that might ordinarily have taken 10 years to achieve, and we've had 10 weeks. I experienced a real sense of community throughout the comments that were coming in during the presentation, and real validation of everyone's feelings about what we're experiencing ourselves and what we're seeing throughout our workforces. And I particularly liked your line, Petra, around the human interactions being the jam that sticks us all together. And the real vital importance of self-care, particularly at leadership levels. And the importance of becoming our own sat-navs, that will definitely stick with me. I want to throw the floor open now, if we could develop some of those really useful contributions that we had during the chat, or if there's any particular areas that participants would like Petra to elaborate on a little more fully at this stage. So you can do a virtual wave or an actual wave. I'm going to pick on Louise Ward-Hunter, who, like Jennifer Welsh, they've both taken up positions as chief executives during the lockdown, which is, I'm sure, a particular challenge in itself. And Louise, you made some really, really interesting and valuable comments, particularly about what you're seeing in your new workforce there at Belfast Met.
Yes, thank you, Anne. And what I've learned is, I will never be a poker player in my life. And also, I know you can all lip read, which is why I did that when they came to me. I think I came into this call, and there's something, it nearly felt emotional, Petra, actually, as you went through the presentation, because I thought, I recognize all of those things that you're talking about. I'm recognizing them in my staff. And I came into this call straight from a conversation with 4 of my colleagues, middle managers within the Belfast Met, who are caring for hundreds of students at this particular time, and their staff as well. And also, I think Claire McNally pointed out, people also doing homeschooling as well. So all of that juggling that is going on. But the thing that leaped out for me, and Shauna is there and has a young person with her, and that was speaking to me, is the issue of resilience, and what will we take away from this period of time to actually develop resilience within ourselves as leaders, vitally within our staff and within our colleagues. And I happen to be in the service of young people, and it's a big thing for me about mental health and well-being and the resilience of our young people who are coping, seeking to cope at this time and isolated from friends. So, I mean, a bunch of stuff in there for me, all hugely relevant. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Louise. Anyone else want to add to those comments or reflections? Now, if you want to contribute, if you could unmute. We're just flicking through. Geraldine O'Hare. Yeah. I think we've got you unmuted there.
Hi there. Thanks very much, and thanks Petra for a great presentation. I think it's reflective of where we're all at in terms of our position within the organisations. I suppose it's more a comment and maybe just a reflection. I think a lot of us are working through looking at recovery plans, and I imagine that it's going to be much more difficult for us to manage the recovery as opposed to the exit and the lockdown, etc. So it's really important that we look at how we manage staff expectations, because I think the outset in terms of the exit from normal practice, etc. People were finding their space and finding their new norm, and I think it's really important how we collectively manage staff morale going forward, how we manage their expectations, because I think probably like you said, the engagement and the connections at the outset were absolutely critical to build that trust, but it's about seeing that through into the future and being able to maintain that resilience and keeping that staff trust. Everybody will have different expectations and want different things. Roles will have changed, priorities will have changed, where you fit in an organisation will have changed. So it's a bit about finding your space and finding where your belonging is, and that's going to take a lot of management as well, I imagine.
I think that's very important, Geraldine. I would agree with you. The speed with which the changes were put in place and the level of camaraderie and support for each other was really positive. It was really heady, and it was an exciting and invigorating phase, albeit that there was high levels of anxiety and so on. But actually what we did in a very short time was phenomenal, and the things that all of us did across our organisations was probably more than we could have done in 3 years at other times. And I think in terms of thinking about how we move forward, some of the things that we've been thinking about in our trust is, I suppose, first of all, it goes back to that acknowledging those tensions and acknowledging the challenges and actually naming it, and recognising that people who've gone into new roles to do really important tasks are sort of tired, and they now want to go back. They want to go back to their old world. We all long for the old world, and yet we know within our heads that actually the old world's not happening, and it's not coming as fast as we want it. And I think acknowledging those tensions and acknowledging those challenges is really important, and then beginning to tease out how we work within those priorities and how we reset ourselves into a new position of post-traumatic growth within our organisations, to take the best that we have created through this new experience and terrible experience, and take the best that we had beforehand and build it into what the new organisations and services look like.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just see on a question there from Carly Green.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
my connection's very bad, so I tried to write it in there.
yeah, we can hear you well, Carly.
Oh, can you?
Yeah.
Look, it was really just about remote working and agile working, and obviously I completely agree. Human interaction is really, really important. Particularly, I mean, I'm a researcher, and there's times creativity spans from getting in a room with people and drawing things up. But I've really seen some positives, and obviously this is a very unique situation, and remote working wouldn't look like this in the future. But I was just keen to see, is there a link really between a positive well-being and kind of that agile, flexible working patterns and remote working, and is anybody really thinking about this for the future?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of work going on across the whole of not just the public sector. Obviously, the private sector has to deal with this as well. And I'm certainly aware there's some work going on within the civil service. And I'm not sure if Brett Hannum is still with us, if you're across any of that, Brett, from your perspective. But certainly, I mean, we're simply not going to be able to get everyone back into offices very quickly to facilitate social distancing. So there's going to be a significant level of home working for quite some time. There's a lot of work required there around linking that to HR policies and how that actually plays out. But there's also a lot of work will be required to develop remote working capabilities within teams, and preserving that jam that Petra talked about to keep teams and organisations together. I'm not sure if any other participants have developed that within their own workplaces yet, in terms of the longer plans for getting people back into buildings, or how they're going to manage the social distancing over the next 6 months or so.
And I'm happy to speak about that. It's Jennifer
Great.
Welsh.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Apologies for joining late and also having to duck out partway through. I suppose we've, from a health and social care perspective, yes, we have been doing a lot of this. Non-clinical or non-front-facing staff who could easily work from home, that was the way we moved into that, and we had to very, very quickly. Obviously, in terms of a hands-on patient or client-facing service, we can't do that everywhere. But there are even really practical things now in terms of consultants that share offices and how do we socially distance. So we're even talking about what days of the week will you be in the office and what days of the week will you be in the office. So I think we're going to be in a very mixed economy for quite a long time as we start to juggle our way through this. I mean, it's even things like limiting the number of people that can come to an outpatients department because we have to create that distance. Therefore, are we running into evening and weekend working and so on? So it's going to be hugely different for us for a long time. And I think one of the biggest issues that we're going to have is it's not just for all of our staff in terms of things are going to be different, but it's that outward message to our public that things are going to be very different, and bear with us as we try and work our way through all of this. So yeah, challenges ahead.
And I guess home working will be different once there's more regular childcare available. I think it's the juggling with the homeschooling that people are finding a huge challenge at the minute. But thank you, Carly, for that, and hopefully you're able to still hear us okay.
Hi, Anne, and everyone. Thanks very much, Petra. That was lovely. Really, really interesting and thought-provoking. Just on what the query you had about, I work in local government, so we're, like a lot of our other organisations, looking through the recovery plan in terms of the people, the spaces, the rooms, a lot of what Jennifer had been touching on as well. The other thing that we're looking at is infrastructure in terms of workplaces and spaces of the future. So, and touching on Petra's story actually about the 3 people building. So not looking at as a building, but much more than that, and how it will be not future proofed as such, but ready for this more agile environment. And I do think that, I mean, as an organisation, we were looking at agile working as a policy issue and a HR practice and procedure. But this, like probably a lot of other organisations, has thrown us into that. So we've just had to throw people into agile working, which are very different circumstances than would be going forward. So I would be really keen if someone was looking at or doing work or research on workplaces and spaces of the future to follow up on that too. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Claire. And yes, absolutely. I've just put on the comments that we're working with the team in the NICS who's looking at agile working, and we do hope to convene a CEF briefing on that in the near future. So we'll keep you all posted on that. We've a couple of minutes before we want to wrap up. If anyone else wants to throw in. Great. I think, Petra, that means you've done a really, really comprehensive job in terms of taking us through all the issues that, that we need to be thinking about. I know, Heather, from your perspective in both the Public Sector Chairs Forum and the NHS Confederation, you've been looking at a lot of those issues as well. And indeed, we'll continue working together to bring these sorts of briefings to our members over coming weeks and months.
Yes, very much. It's just really great to have Petra do that for health and then right across the sector. So a lot of the work that we'll be doing is trying to work with and the Public Sector Chairs Forum to gather the learning and the audit office so that we can go forward and just sustaining and also beginning to think, create space while everybody's working flat out, is to create space about what is, to try and find ways to articulate what is this new norm, what do we need to learn and to capture, and what do we need to support, and then trying to do a wee bit of work around, you know, as pressure comes on budgets and shaping how we move forward, how do we do that more collectively rather than in bits? How do we pull together to learn, you know, working, and you can see that even this way of working, so on, we've been really pleased with how many people have engaged. So we've got folk from local government, from central government, from ALBs, from non-executive director positions, and Francis in charities. So we're beginning to build some of that thinking across the sector, because I think, as you can see in some of the earlier comments, it's how you engage people, how you empower people to be part of the recovery will help us all to do that. So as Anne says, we're going to be recording this and we'll share it with folks so that you can use it within your own organisations. And if you want to feed back, we'll be trying to develop more of these kinds of sessions that help and support members, or we can do roundtables. Just let us know what you need. So it just really remains to me to thank really Petra for an absolutely fantastic presentation, and Anne and Pamela in the Chief Execs Forum for doing all the hard work behind the scenes. So thank you very much for joining us today. Oh, and we'll share the slides as well with colleagues too.
Okay. Thanks for asking me. It was lovely. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.